Hello, I'm Esther George, President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. I'm pleased to welcome you to our annual Agricultural Symposium and to the family farm in Northwest Missouri, where I grew up. Agriculture has changed a great deal over the decades on this farm and across the globe. It remains, however, a key sector of the U.S. economy and a critical component of the 10th Federal Reserve District's economy. Because of our region's strong connection to agriculture, the Kansas City Fed remains committed to a deep understanding of agriculture and ag-related businesses. We conduct research and industry surveys, and importantly, we gain insight from our engagement with those connected to agriculture. This approach brings perspective on current issues affecting the sector, as well as emerging issues and trends. Over time, science and technology have significantly changed agriculture. Understanding the impact of those changes for the U.S. economy and the world is important to policymakers. This symposium is one of the Kansas City Fed's flagship programs. It's an opportunity to discuss topics that not only matter today, but that also have far-reaching influence on global agriculture and consumers in the future. This family farm is a reminder of the roots of U.S. agriculture, and our focus today will be both its past and its future. Thank you for joining us for this year's symposium, The Roots of Agricultural Productivity Growth.
Hello and welcome. My name is Nate Kaufman, and I am Vice President, Economist, and Omaha Branch Executive with the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. I join with Kansas City Fed President Esther George in welcoming you to our 2021 Agricultural Symposium, which we have titled The Roots of Agricultural Productivity Growth. As we heard from Esther just now, agriculture is rooted in the region that we serve at the Kansas City Fed. This is a region that includes Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Wyoming, the northern half of New Mexico, and the western third of Missouri. We are committed to understanding agriculture and perspectives from the sector in discussions on the broader economy, not just for our region, but nationally and globally. In my role, I oversee efforts at our bank to track agricultural economic and financial conditions, as well as contribute to broader Federal Reserve System efforts to monitor conditions in agriculture. As part of those responsibilities, I'm proud to serve as host for this year's Agricultural Symposium, which is now in its 11th year. This is the first year that we've hosted the program virtually, though, and we're connecting with the largest audience ever for the event. Of course, as other things have been the past year, the event will be a bit different in this virtual setting. I always look forward to gathering in person, not just to collectively engage on a topic, but also because of the informal discussions and connections that happen at tables and during breaks and side conversations. As much as possible, though, we want to continue to hear from you throughout this year's program. You'll notice a link on your player page to submit questions and comments. Each session will have time dedicated for questions at the end. You can submit questions at any time, and we will ask as many as time allows. We also invite your comments or reactions throughout the program. Additionally, we will ask a polling question at the start of each of the 4 sessions and look forward to exploring the results during the closing discussion tomorrow. You are also invited to continue the conversation on social media. We'll be using hashtag KCFedAg2021 on Twitter throughout the next 2 days, and we look forward to the conversation happening there. One of the benefits of a virtual program is that anyone can connect from anywhere, but that also means we're bridging many different time zones, of course. And the timing of some sessions might be inconvenient to local time, whether that means falling in the middle of lunch or in the middle of the night for our friends in India. We hope that you're able to join for as much as possible during the live sessions, but the program will also be available for playback following the conclusion of the live event, first through this webcast location and eventually via our website at kansascityfed.org/agriculture. An important part of our work at the Kansas City Fed is to monitor emerging developments in agriculture while also recognizing longer-term trends. And before turning our attention to the topic of productivity and its long-term implications, I'd like to spend just a few minutes discussing the state of our agricultural economy in the United States and how the sector has changed over just the past year. As some examples of the magnitude of changes in just the past year, corn and soybean prices have roughly doubled from a year ago. The prices of other major commodities, in addition to those in smaller markets, are also significantly higher. At one point last year, retail beef prices increased by 10% in just 1 month before retreating as disruptions related to the pandemic began to ease. Perhaps most notable of the scale of disruptions related to the pandemic and the global disruptions specifically, the FAO's Global Food Price Index is about 30% higher today than a year ago as many nations continue to struggle with the economic devastation of the pandemic. These examples underscore a striking reversal of agricultural economic conditions that prevailed at the beginning of 2020, and I'd like to spend just a few minutes describing how those conditions have evolved to where we are today. When we look back at the beginning of 2020, it's important to recognize what financial conditions had looked like in agriculture at that time. We had been talking about a prolonged downturn in the agricultural economy with 6 to 7 years of what I would characterize as relatively low agricultural commodity prices. This was happening when, in the United States, for example, we were actually seeing one of the longest economic expansions on record play out in the broader economy. But agriculture had been in a different place. Agricultural commodity prices had been low, profit margins had been thin, and for multiple consecutive years, the sector had been struggling with limited profitability. As we looked at the beginning of 2020, there was maybe an expectation that some of those pressures would continue. There was maybe an expectation that, for example, bankruptcies on farms could continue at the modest pace that it had been increasing. We might continue to see financial stress. We might continue to see some pressure on land values and other indicators that we track on a regular basis. That was the environment at the beginning of 2020. There were many indicators that suggested that incomes could continue to be stretched thin and that there may be additional pressure. We all know then what happened as March and April progressed and we started to see some of the initial effects of the pandemic. And I obviously will not go into all of the details of how that pandemic had affected ag at the time and how it has continued to affect agriculture, but I will highlight 4 specific areas. The first is the general macroeconomic environment surrounding the pandemic and the implications of that, for example, for things like trade. During the first several months of 2020, we were seeing pressure on agricultural trade that had fallen alongside some of the pandemic. There was a concern that as a sharp contraction in economic growth proceeded, there would be less ability for nations, for example, to be able to spend on agricultural products and households as well. So the first was recognizing the pressures that came about initially with the pandemic connected to macroeconomics and trade. The second is somewhat related and has specifically to do with spending from households. As we started to see economies shut down and businesses need to go into lockdown mode for a while, households began shifting the way that they bought food and agriculturally related products. They stopped spending, for example, on food at restaurants and other food service establishments and began spending more at grocery markets and supermarkets and other stores where those products were being sold in a very different form. So that generated the first sign of some limitations in terms of supply chains and some of the disruptions that caused as it relates to agricultural markets. The third that I would highlight is the broad disruptions that we saw with COVID-19 at meatpacking plants and other food processing facilities. At one point during the peak of the crisis back in April and into May, many of our meat processing facilities in the United States were operating at just 60% capacity. So again, consistent with how consumers were buying products differently than they had been in the months prior, these disruptions at meatpacking plants were another bottleneck for producers that were selling to those plants, but then also for consumers who were looking to purchase products in a different way than they had been in the past and seeing prices rise. The fourth and final component of the pandemic that I'll highlight from the initial months, and then I'll move on to more recent developments, was that specifically associated with biofuel use and production. In the United States, ethanol represents a major demand source for corn, for example, and corn obviously has an impact on other parts of the agricultural economy. As we started to see consumers and households moving about less and just generally traveling less and spending less in that way during April and May, ethanol production, for example, dropped by about 50% and is a significant demand source for agricultural production, represented a headwind for the sector. So in April and May last year, there was a view that there would be significant pressure by the end of 2020 that we now know actually did not end up being the case, and I'll spend just a minute on that. There was a feeling that maybe we would see some pressure on land values, that we would see further pressure on agricultural commodity prices, which had already been pressured on top of pressure that had begun 2020. Despite some of these significant concerns, though, about the intensifying pressures in agriculture, and again, those were pressures that had already existed to some extent before the pandemic, markets have rebounded substantially as economies across the globe have begun to reopen, households return to pre-pandemic spending habits, and global trade creates new opportunities, albeit with ongoing uncertainty and potential disruption that still will be important. Today, the prices of some major agricultural commodities are more than double what they were at the beginning of 2020, before the pandemic. And the set of challenges and opportunities is now very different from just a short while ago. As we assess prospects for prices, farm income, and the financial health of the sector, productivity growth will be a primary determinant to that future path. It's against this backdrop of agricultural conditions over the past year, this year's program will explore the key drivers of agricultural productivity growth, linkages to other industries, and environmental considerations. We began discussions for the topic of this year's program well in advance of the pandemic by recognizing, first, long-term increases in agricultural productivity growth, even when productivity gains in the broader economy had at times been more subdued. This productivity growth has been a key determinant of the structure of agricultural markets, global trade flows, and the formulation of prices. As in the past, productivity will shape agricultural markets in the future. Furthermore, events of the past year have highlighted additional need for research on the topic of productivity as we monitor developments brought into focus throughout the pandemic related to supply chain disruptions, food shortages, labor availability, and other significant economic challenges. This year's program will include 4 sessions over the next 2 days to explore the topic of productivity growth, in addition to a couple keynote presentations and opportunities throughout for you as attendees to engage in the symposium. The session format for the symposium will include a speaker, followed by a discussant, and then 2 panelists. Our first speaker in each session will be presenting a summary of their research focused on the topic of the respective session. Their papers, written for this symposium, are available on our website, and I would encourage you to read them if you haven't yet had the chance. Please note that in addition to the papers, all materials for this year's symposium, including the program with participant bios, speaker presentations, and supporting content, are available on our website. Prior to each session, we will also look for your input on topics related to productivity by asking you to respond to a polling question. After you submit your answer, you will be invited to provide any comments or context about your selection using the Questions Comments link. We will share the results of these polling questions during our closing discussion tomorrow at 12:15 Central Time, so please be sure to join for that as well.